So the first session, which we began with, was looking at the topic of scaling. We identified some challenges in the presentations and in our interactive session between the different regions. And looking at what was identified, I have to say most of the challenges are shared between the regions, particularly the issue of coordination between the many different stakeholders, the public partners, the private partners, the need for there to be good business models, for example, for the private sector, and the need to have alignment with large national programs, for example, which characterize the Latin American sector. And of course, including academics in those links between producers and also organizations. And of course, for topics of public policy and financing for rural-based projects. One difference which I think I noticed, perhaps in North Africa, is very mentioned low levels of farmer organization and weak extension systems in Tunisia. So that might possibly be more of an issue in those contexts compared to Latin America. But beyond this, also the issue of low market access was mentioned. But beyond this, I would say most of the challenges appear to be shared in terms of scaling. In terms of the solutions which are being identified in the CLCA project, again, there's a lot of the same solutions obviously being applied, but I think also some differences. So what came up very clearly in the Latin American context is the importance of the different dialogues between the stakeholders, especially about which occurs in the knowledge hubs, which characterize applications there. The importance of having interdisciplinary teams to make sure the interventions do reach farmers and that they do respond to their needs, and the need also to find common objectives with public stakeholders. And I think the difference, again, being that in North Africa, there was identified maybe a lack of organization, a lack of entry points perhaps to communities, the importance of having initiatives to organize local communities into groups and cooperatives and empower local administrative leaders so that you have that link with the local public sector, and to really, again, have good business models for public and private partnerships to involve all of the stakeholders. So really, in the area of scaling, it was an issue of partnerships and agreements. The next session, and we will include on the website a presentation from the Latin American context where everything is represented. But the main findings from Tunisia, there was a big focus on the importance of strengthening phone access for women, so that targeting information can take place both with husbands and wives. The greatest increase in uptake was seen not only when husbands were being focused or those are focused on targeting women, but actually when both people in the household were being targeted, that led to the greatest uptake. The importance of introducing innovation in tandem, particularly so that you can avoid increasing women's labor burden as some innovations are adopted. So one good example, which was very popular, were the handheld seeders. The importance of developing role models among women as well, and taking into account within the study, which was done in Tunisia, and we will include on the website, and I'm sure it's available on the CLCA website, and all of the studies which were done, but that they did identify some different recommendations for CLCA among men and women, which should be taken into account. And then the audience observations from their own respective contexts. What were the examples in which gender may have affected the uptake of CLCA innovations? There were two examples in Latin America related to when livestock production becomes more professionalized. You have, for example, in Bolivia, the production of fodder in relay cropping. Sorry, I must think I'm still with you. Good. And we have the, in Mexico, there was also the production of nutrition blocks, both of which were important. And so in those cases, there was potentially a disempowerment of women, which would have to be looked at. But then also in Bolivia, some opportunities, for example, the production of seedlings for windbreaks and grasses, with women having already a good capacity for managing nurseries, they were thought to be good at, well, to have an advantage, perhaps an opportunity opened up by by this intervention by CLCA. And then in North Africa, there's the opportunity for household dairy processing in that context. And when there was less access to fodder, that had a negative impact on women in Tunisia. And so the CLCA project was addressing that directly with a focus on feed and forages. The third session, we really looked at the technical options which were being promoted in CLCA systems. And we found many similarities across contexts and also some differences. So for example, when we're talking about the soil health, we're talking about diversifying the crops which are being grown on the soils. In Bolivia, there was a good option of legume production and fallow, but that was relatively low compared to the importance of intercropping with other forage crops. With Mexico, depending on the environment, intercropping could be more successful in some contexts, whereas fallow land was more successful in other, in the lowland contexts. Whereas in Algeria and Tunisia, it's very different. The intercropping didn't take off so much, but the crop rotation was something which was better to apply. One innovation which was very specific and I think considered very successful in Bolivia and Mexico, which could not be replicated in North Africa, were the live barriers, which provide a number of services to farms, insect control, soil health, I think water retention. So that was a really key innovation in those areas, which wasn't necessarily seen in North Africa. And then the similarities also, of course, in Bolivia, the use of livestock fertilizer in that particular context. And I think in all contexts as well, there was really, the importance of obviously ground cover, low till, that's key to CLCA, and really, training people in producing forages and having a mixture of well-adapted forages to the local context. That was successful across everywhere. And then maybe some differences. Well, also between Mexico and Algeria, we mentioned the issue of controlling pasture and having that balance, that trade-off between animal pasture and this model, for example, the 30-30 stubble grazing model in Algeria, supplementing the controlled pasture and the fodder production with also feed pellets was also a common innovation. And then specific to North Africa, we saw an importance on small scale mechanization, which can either be in seeding, for example, for forage crops, for legumes, but also for harvest mechanization to reduce labor and reduce losses at the same time. And again, only in North Africa, a real focus on irrigated systems and increasing water use efficiency with better irrigation techniques, and also with conservation agriculture really helped with the uptake and the outcomes for farmers. And then, of course, the opportunity for changing crop production. A similar, I guess, for starting point for the project in all of these countries were the existence of important cash crops. So in Bolivia, quinoa, in North Africa, you have wheat, in Mexico, you have maize, and then that over time impoverishing the soil and leading to a lesser focus on livestock. That was the common starting point, I think, across all contexts. So there was, at least in Tunisia, the opportunity to alter crop production to include other crops. So which were the most, out of all of this landscape of different technologies which were being tried, which were the most effective in integrating crop and livestock systems? Of course, in Bolivia, using llama fertilizer directly connected livestock production to quinoa production. In Mexico, it was found that through intercropping, it was possible to increase the forage available without impacting on maize yields. With Algeria, there was the 30-30 systems, and which helped with the trade-off. And while producing forages, again, improved animal production and health, so it was synergistic in that sense. In Tunisia, there was the example of linking conservation agriculture to irrigation, to improvements in irrigation, and a regenerative agriculture approach to improve soils. The most successful ones in these contexts, as I mentioned, were in Bolivia, the live barriers, in Mexico, the intercropping. In Tunisia, it's interesting, the public-private partnerships for the forage mixtures and small machinery was the most successful. And then finally, in Algeria, again, the same approach was very popular. I think the forages, production, the handheld machinery, but also the water saving. And across all contexts, so what else can we need was more publications, more partnerships, more outreach, especially with youth, due to the lack of youth presence in these systems. Having a long-term presence, for example, the hubs, which are present in Mexico, digital outreach in terms of webinars, and just generally more business models and better communications between all the actors involved. Onto the session where we heard from Santiago and from Ayman on the importance of multi-criteria assessment and trade-offs. Well, among the participants, we identified many criteria which can be considered when assessing the performance of current systems and CLCA, conservation agriculture and alternatives in livestock systems. So that was interesting, just the amount of factors which have to be taken into account, the possible trade-offs between these factors to be considered. So I think that really hammered home the importance of the multi-criteria assessment and the value of the research which is being produced in these contexts. And so within this, we identified that although we did this exercise across all regions, the trade-offs can be very context specific. So again, the importance of research, deep research into these trade-offs and the criteria is important. But there's also a time scale element as this, to this as well. So a technology not only needs to be useful in the long term, but also needs to provide a short-term benefit within the world of these trade-offs. Properly understand which are the entry points into the system, where can we find levers which move, and then really understand how farmers are thinking, how they themselves perceive these trade-offs and make their decisions. Within that, co-designing solutions with farmers was very important. And the women are sometimes the entry point for some really key trade-offs as well, or mainly affected by some trade-offs. And then finally, I think 2 points about having a holistic solution. So collective investments which can overcome some trade-offs where there might be multiple entry points, and having a complementary set of solutions to balance your intervention into the system. In terms of farm level modeling, we heard from Santiago about the approach and how you can use that to understand some of these trade-offs. And we heard from the audience what was the reaction to these models, what is useful. So some of these are, you got some insights into which of the most useful practices. You can actually give a value to all the different types of data which you might be collecting. You can give a comparative value by comparing their impact on farmers. You can assess the impact of the technology adoption and really understand what are those decision processes and which are the entry points to farmers. And finally, the obstacles, a lack of the specialized skills which are sometimes needed to produce these models, to interpret these models, especially to collect the data, where you need to have these finely curated data sets, a need for advanced softwares. So the project would have to provide licenses, and really a lack of trainings to start using some simple modeling techniques, not to go in at the deep end necessarily, but to start making use and finding some benefits which aren't necessarily clear to everybody. And then finally, the last session, we looked at the process of documenting innovations and the importance of that to outreach and also to the longevity and the legacy of the CLCA project. So we had the interesting case in Latin America of Mexico, where they really thought out how to reach their end users, for farmers, especially with the constraints being imposed by the pandemic. One strategy which I thought was interesting was if they had to use digital means to overcome the lack of access during COVID, considering whether younger farmers, where they can be identified, can be an entry point. And then, of course, in these strategies, it's really important in both contexts to have mixed media formats, publications, but also videos and handhelds, but not to forget the traditional formats, which still remained highly relevant even with the COVID affectation. And of course, again, the example of knowledge hubs. And the example which I found was interesting, and here you can see in the bottom right, one of the videos which was produced for farmers to learn about nutritional blocks for livestock. And then one of the interesting examples I found from North Africa was where including farmer feedback throughout the process also led to the adaptation of machinery to process legume seeds. So that's an example where one element of project uptake was then supported by another solution, that importance of having multiple solutions. And that farmer feedback, that close engagement is really driven by demonstration days, trainings and monitoring visits, which continue to be really key for outreach. Then we had a discussion about the broader knowledge management approach and the documentation which should take place at the end of the project. And so we had some recommendations, but we should really attempt to consolidate all information on the CLCA project website, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, including anything from CIMIT, possibly even linking with other resources which are out there. And of course, but there's a multiplication always of sources, of domains on the internet. So we need to ensure the permanency of the online resources, and being that they are located within ICARA, for example, hopefully they should be permanent. And that as we're moving into this last stage of the project, we need to make sure that we share any further material